Hello, and welcome back to Contingent History. My guest today is Dr. Christy Cobb. Christy is an associate professor of early Christianity at the University of Denver, where she focuses on several subjects like gender and sexuality, slavery in the ancient Mediterranean world, as well as the New Testament and Christian apocryphal texts. She's the author of Slavery, Gender, Truth, and Power in Luke, Acts, and Other Ancient Narratives, as well as an editor of Ancient Slavery in its New Testament context. Today we'll be discussing slavery in the New Testament and the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles. So, Christy, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, what got you interested in studying these subjects?
Yeah, so I sort of began thinking about women in the Bible really broadly when I was an undergraduate. I grew up in the South and sort of the Bible Belt, and I had a lot of questions as a young person about women's roles, women's leadership, and the verses that were often used to sort of place women in certain contexts within the church. And so I started out really focusing pretty broadly on women in the Bible, and then I narrowed it down to the New Testament. And then I discovered that slavery was sort of an area where basically women weren't being addressed as as closely. Slavery is an institution that marginalizes certainly certain groups of people, but especially enslaved women get very they don't get much attention at all. And so that's how I sort of found my way into slavery and gender within the New Testament and early Christian texts.
Great, very cool. Can you maybe give us like an overview of what slavery was like in the ancient world? Do we have any idea how common it was and how people might have become enslaved during that time?
Yes, that's such a great question. Slavery was very common in antiquity. Numbers wise, in the period of, say, the Roman Empire, we think maybe from 15% to 25% of the population was enslaved. It depended on your location, how many enslaved people would be in your area. So, for example, in Rome, a sort of bustling city, those numbers would be much higher. So more like perhaps the 25%, whereas in rural areas, then it's going to be less, less people would be enslaved. But regardless of the area that you were in antiquity, slavery would affect your life as an ancient person. So enslaved persons did pretty much almost every job available in antiquity, and slavery affected the economy. Slavery was present in even people who weren't very rich or elite might have one enslaved person in their house, maybe two, to do domestic tasks, especially. And then if you were, even more elite, you might have someone doing your accounting, doing your books, right? Selling products for you. Certainly in the domestic sphere, helping with all the, domestic tasks like cooking and cleaning and laundry and childcare. All of those things were mostly servile labor. And so it was very, very common. As I said, I think slavery could affect everyone in antiquity. So there was who could become enslaved. A large number of enslaved persons came from war, basically. So from a country who, the Roman Empire, let's say, going into a certain area and, colonializing that area, then the people in that area would be enslaved, sometimes killed, of course, but also enslaved and brought back. So large numbers of people were enslaved through that. But the largest number of enslaved persons actually, came from birth. So if you were born to a woman who was enslaved, so if your mother was enslaved, then you were enslaved. And so the population of unfree persons in antiquity grew simply from impregnating enslaved women. And that would be a really sort of I guess in the view of antiquity, in ancient persons, an easy way to grow your enslaved labor in your household is through the use of enslaved women. And so ultimately, anyone could be enslaved in antiquity. There wasn't a direct, racial element if we're going to compare it to, say, transatlantic slavery. Race was involved in ancient slavery practices, but it wasn't that one group of people were always enslaved. Instead, if you were living in a place that was then attacked, you could be enslaved. Sometimes people were kidnapped and sold into slavery. Some people were enslaved through debt, right? Some children who were abandoned were then enslaved, even if they were born free. So the fear of enslavement was also really active in antiquity. That the sort of malleability between who was enslaved and who was free, was frightened people sometimes. And so, because of course people wanted to be free, right? And wanted free status in antiquity. Did I explain that well? Did I leave out any pieces that you want me to clarify?
No, I think that was great. And yeah, I think it's good to kind of like contextualize it a little bit too, because we particularly living in the US have like a maybe certain idea of slavery and
Mm-hmm.
what that looked like, who became enslaved, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that was helpful. And it's interesting to think about the percentage of the population that was probably enslaved,
Mm-hmm.
15 to 25% in some places, you said, which is likely higher than the number of people who were literate in the ancient world, um, which is just kind of another way to kind of contextualize that, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
A
yeah,
question I
and
get a lot is that question about sort of comparing it to our more contemporary context of slavery. And so I think it is important to think about the differences and the similarities between those two systems of slavery.
yeah. Now, was it possible for people to escape slavery, or
Yes.
was it kind of a lifelong thing? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a process for freedom in antiquity, which is called manumission. That was also relatively common in antiquity. So you could, so ultimately, people were freed through manumission a couple of different routes: informal manumission and then formal manumission. Formal manumission would lead to freedom and Roman citizenship. So you could escape slavery through formal manumission, and then you could be a Roman citizen. Now, even when you were freed, you still retained, the status was freed, not free, if that makes sense. So you were like a previously enslaved person. So that sort of stain of slavery stayed with you all through your life, and you couldn't really get rid of that, even if you had, managed to get freed. That stuck with you. So one way we see this is on ancient funerary monuments after a person has died, and if someone basically builds a monument for the deceased, they would put an L in front of your name, meaning freed, basically previously enslaved or freed status. And so that you can see how that even if you gain freedom, you still have the mark of slavery with you. But that was one way people could, the manumission process was a way people could be freed. There were also slave revolts in antiquity. Enslaved persons ran away, tried to escape slavery. So, and we have some stories of that, of people successfully sort of running away and restarting their life. And so there was a variety of sort of different ways to escape slavery, but even still with that, slavery would have marked these people. So when you were freed, even through manumission, you often still had to retain connections to your enslaver. You often still had to give a percentage of your any money that you had to your enslaver, your previous enslaver. You retained their name after being freed. So there was, a lot of sort of connections even after freedom, even after finding freedom in antiquity.
Yeah, so that kind of never left them, unfortunately, it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, there's a couple passages I want to read all of us from the New Testament here before I ask the next question.
Okay.
Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and trembling. That's Ephesians chapter 6 verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, not with a slavery performed merely for looks to please people, but wholeheartedly. That's from Colossians chapter 3 verse 22. And the last one, let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 20 to 21. So we might be able to debate like the context of verses like that a little bit, and I think context is important. I don't want to dismiss that, but I also don't think we should dismiss the fact that we're talking about humans owning other humans.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are kind of left with this impression when reading the New Testament that it is really ingrained in the early Christian movement. But
Mm-hmm.
was there any sense in which slavery was an issue for early Jesus followers?
Mm. Um, we unfortunately don't see anything in the New Testament. I mean, the verses that you gave are important ones to study, but we don't see any um active discussions about slavery being, let's say, immoral, right? Or that it doesn't align with, say, the message that Jesus was preaching found in the Gospels, right? And so what we see is, you know, slaves obey your masters, right? Like as you're seeing in the household codes. In the Gospels, Jesus uses slavery within parables in the Synoptic Gospels, just prevalently. I mean, it's everywhere in the parables that sort of using a example from a household who has enslaved persons is a part of Jesus's teaching. And so within that, we don't see, evidence of basically Jesus saying, if you want to be a follower of me, free your enslaved persons, right? And so we don't have that. We do have later, we have texts that in early Christianity that do certainly debate things about slavery. So some of the church fathers, for example, do talk about sort of not mistreating slaves heavily, right? So physical punishment of enslaved persons. We have, when we get to the monastic movement in sort of late antiquity, we have evidence of, texts of people freeing their slaves before they move into a monastery, for example. We also have some texts that suggest that slavery isn't compatible with religious beliefs. So we do have some evidence of people sort of, debating this, in a few of our texts, especially when we get into some later texts. We don't see those within the New Testament or in the earliest texts of Christianity per se.
Right. But I guess kind of along the way, there's kind of a growing, I don't know if discomfort is the right word to use, but something akin to that, perhaps, that
Yeah, I don't know
this
if I would
starts to
call it.
develop.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call it growing. I think we'll see is a few people that voice their concerns about slavery, but the majority of of early Christians seem to be completely fine with slavery and seem to think slavery is compatible with their version of Christianity. And then we have a few people that are sort of outliers of that majority view. Does that make sense?
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are
I would
there
also
any?
Oh,
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead. Yeah.
I'll also add, we don't have any sort of text that represent an enslaved person's point of view, but we should assume that enslaved persons who might have been Christians were not okay with slavery, right? That
Right.
seems like a sort of logical conclusion to make, but unfortunately, we just don't have any text, extant text that survive that provide an enslaved person's point of view from within Christianity.
Right. Fair point. Are there any enslaved individuals that we might say are like hiding in plain sight when we're reading through early Christian texts, things like the
Mm.
Gospels?
Yes, I think they're everywhere, hiding in plain sight. Um, I think anytime you read about a meal in early Christianity, for example, we should assume that there might have been enslaved persons preparing that meal, serving that meal, greeting people, as they come to, say, a house where early Christians might be meeting, which we read a lot about. Also, hiding in plain sight are letter deliverers. I mean, I think when we think about the letters you just quoted from in the New Testament, those would have likely been copied, delivered, read by enslaved persons who were messengers. I mean, so really hiding in plain sight because one way we rely upon the transmission of these letters were from enslaved labor, right? Who were traveling and bringing these from all over the Roman Empire, ultimately spreading the message of what becomes Christianity through the writing of letters. I also, because of my work on gender, I think hiding in plain sight are the women, right? Enslaved women would have really been present in most households, raising Christian children, serving as midwives, serving as wet nurses, just really carrying the brunt of that domestic labor. And when we think about the way that early Christianity was very early on meeting in houses, then we need to remember that enslaved women would have been there, right? As you put it, hiding in plain sight, I think.
Right, right.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to shift a little bit now to talk about the Apocryphal Acts. Obviously, a lot of people, a lot of my listeners are familiar with the New Testament canon,
Mm-hmm.
but there were a lot of other early Christian texts that were very popular in the ancient world that didn't make it into that canon, that still tell us a lot about the early Christian movement, different things that the people in that movement might have cared about. And the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles are texts, are a good example of texts like these, I think. And so when we're talking about the Apocryphal Acts, what is it that we're actually talking about? What are those texts?
Yeah, great. I love the Apocryphal Acts. They are narratives, so written in early Christianity, that are they basically each one follows a apostle. So very similar to the canonical acts. The canonical acts follows Peter and then Paul and their travels for sort of, building and growing early Christianity. And the Apocryphal Acts does that, but through different apostles. And so Peter does have his own Apocryphal Act as well as Paul, but then there's also Thomas, and there's Thecla, who's not at all in the New Testament, but a female apostle that gets paired often with Paul in that. There's apocryphal acts of John, of Andrew. There's many of these, and each of them basically have a very similar plot, that the apostle is going to be chosen to go to a certain region of the world and to share the gospel message. And they arrive in this area and they start converting people, usually elite persons. And often this begins with the women. And so they'll get an elite female follower, often in the Apocryphal Acts. that woman's husband is not a fan of Christianity and so becomes an antagonist within the narrative. Um, and enslaved persons play really heavy roles in these texts as well, because of the elite status of the converts to Christianity. Then many of them have enslaved persons in their household working for them, and so you see some of that labor right in the text themselves. So I would say these texts are, they're fiction, but they are giving us glimpses into a history and into a narrative world of early Christianity. They're written sometime after the canonical Acts, and then they're continue to be written all the way into late antiquity and even the early medieval period. We have some that were written, and so there's a number of them. They were pretty popular and read for both entertainment purposes and also pedagogical reasons. And so early Christians were kind of learning how to be Christians through these texts. And also, they might just have enjoyed reading them, I think. They sort of mimic the Greek and Roman novels of the time period, which were really popular, but were not centered within Christianity. They would have centered Roman religion, basically. And so the early Christian narratives give this, a sort of way in for early Christians to experience that fun, entertaining narrative. And then many of the Apocryphal Acts do, just to sort of counter the fun entertainment aspect, they end in a martyrdom. So we also have the martyrdom of that main apostle, usually in the text. And then so it gives us a sort of martyrology text as well.
Right. Yeah. So I want to circle back to the subject of slavery in the Apocryphal Acts, but before I
Yes.
do that, do we have any idea who was writing these, like who the
Mm.
authors of these texts were?
Yeah, we kind of don't. I mean, we can make some guesses. Um, Usually, an elite male probably, writing this. And what we know about writing and enslavement right now is that elite men used enslaved persons to help them do the writing and the transcription and editorial work as well. And so, but we do seem to get the perspectives of the elite within these texts. But we don't, just like actually the New Testament Acts, we don't have a clear authorship, to know exactly who was writing these.
Circling back to slavery, then in these texts, is there or are there ways that enslaved individuals are characterized consistently in the Apocryphal Acts?
Yes, definitely. Um, I mean, in all ancient texts, enslaved persons were often characterized with sort of tropes, right? And so there's a good slave and a bad slave, and often enslaved persons were just placed in these categories without really any complexity. And so a good enslaved person, to sort of track back to the text you read from Ephesians, right, would be obedient, loyal, trustworthy, do exactly what they're asked immediately. And so good enslaved persons were placed in those categories. On the other hand, if an enslaved person was sort of placed in this bad category, they were greedy, they were not trustworthy. For women, they were sexualized, right? And for men, they were lazy and disobedient. And so we see those same tropes, which happen in broad contemporaneous literature from the Roman world. We see those pop up in the Apocryphal Acts as well. So, one example I can just give you is the Acts of Andrew. The elite woman there, her name is Maximilla, and she has she has many enslaved persons in her household, but two women who are named, and, basically work closely with her within the house. And one is Aphidama, who is fits all the good slave characteristics, and then the other one is Euclea, who fits all the bad slave characteristics. And so within that one apocryphal act, we can see these two characters really fitting into this ancient stereotypical view of enslaved persons.
Given that slavery was really ingrained in the ancient world and seems to have kind of made its way into the early Christian movement as well without much, pushback, and given the fact that it's shaped the modern world that we're living in, how do you think educators and readers of early Christian texts should handle this subject and these texts that we're reading?
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think knowledge of ancient slavery helps readers understand the New Testament and early Christian texts. Without that knowledge, sort of reading, as I mentioned, one of Jesus's parables, won't be as fully understood without knowledge of how enslavement worked in antiquity. So I really find it to be a really important part of New Testament scholarship. I'm glad that right now the study of slavery within the New Testament is growing and seems to be more and more prevalent in our scholarship. But I will say, I mean, that my recent volume with Catherine Shaner, Ancient Slavery in the New Testament, that's why we put together that volume, is because we felt it would be helpful for just anyone who's approaching the New Testament and early Christian texts to have some knowledge of how slavery functioned in antiquity, and that will inform their readings. And so I find it to be a really, helpful part of reading practice.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it seems like very, very important work you're doing. So we're appreciative of that. My last question for you then, Christy, what are you currently working on?
Yeah, I'm actually finishing a book on early Christian women. So it's called or enslaved women. So it's called Enslaved Women in Early Christianity, and the subtitle is Invisible Labor. And so it is some of your questions about hiding in plain sight it is very much informed by that work that I'm doing. So the book is coming out with Bloomsbury Academic Press in a new series that's called Sexing Scripture. And that series focuses on sort of women, sexuality, marginalized persons within the Bible and within biblical scholarship. And it also focuses on creative ways of reading these texts. And so I think it's a really good place for this book. What I'm doing in it is I basically argue early Christianity should be understood as relied upon the labor of enslaved women in early Christianity. And then to do that, I tell the stories of 8 enslaved women, ranging from the book of Acts in the New Testament into Apocryphal Acts, and then also into martyrdom, early Christian martyrs. And so I'm excited about it. It's coming to a close. I'm submitting the final manuscript this summer. So
Great. Well, we'll look forward to that for sure.
thanks.
And thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.